Hey, it's Drybear. We're finishing our series of covering every weapon in the First Descendant, and we're down to our last 3. Today we're going to be talking about the ultimate level shotgun, Executor, which is probably pronounced Executor, but Executor sounds so much cooler to me. Now, after running all of the numbers with this weapon, unfortunately it doesn't actually outperform Smithereens in burst damage, but this one is probably on the precipice of being incredibly strong. So if you wanted to wait for a buff, if this gets buffed or touched at all, like I'm serious, it is on like a hair-thin wire of being one of the best weapons in the game if they make any adjustments to it. It's like good right now, but if they change the stats a little bit too much, this thing is going to explode with the amount of damage that it does. It just has one major problem, or I guess 3 major problems, and that is it has a base firearm crit rate of 1%, a base firearm crit damage of 1.1, so 110% damage scaling, and it has a base weak point of 1. This thing has no scaling out of these 3, like it has no crit scaling and almost no weak point scaling. If weak point wasn't additive or wasn't like an overall global scaler, then weak point would be trash. It's still useful in this weapon just because it is a global scaler, but the base value is so incredibly low that it's kind of comical how low it actually is. So these stats are basically dead weight, but it has some really strong elemental scaling, which makes sense because the lore says that it's a weapon created after researching the weapons and components of the Colossus Executioner, the Lightning, the Electric Colossus. So it is a very elemental weapon, and when you build it for element, it can carry its own weight just on element alone, which is why I say that if it ever gets buffed, if they end up buffing the non-elemental portion of its damage, like the crit damage, the base firearm attack, or like the weak point scaling or attribute or anything, it's going to add on top of this elemental damage that we're just about to talk about. So here's the final build for the Executor, and you can see that it tops out at a burst DPS here of 1.2. This is technically actually just basic DPS because its burst is built into its rotation. So let's look at this. If you haven't looked at these sheets, and when I do a summary of all the weapons in the game, I'll re-explain how to read one of these sheets. I've made one for every weapon in the game, but basically right under my head, this is the optimal DPS build, right? So this is what I recommend running for the weapon, or what is the most maximum damage output. The reason we have 2 accuracy mods on here, even though the passive applies accuracy, is because we rely heavily on the passive for this weapon, which requires you to hit all pellets. If you miss a single pellet on a target that doesn't have electrocution on them, you will decrement your passive and it hurts your damage massively. We need every single shot of this weapon to land every single pellet, and it already has a low accuracy, so we're trying to raise that up as much as possible. You could technically put in things like reload expert on this, or even, you know, expand weapon charge or something to get a little bit more value out of this, but if we're going to run the strengthened first shot variant, which is better than real life fighter or unstoppable smasher or elemental conductor in this ultimate slot, then you want to rely on 5 weapon shots and then reload. So the basic gameplay for this is fire 5 times. Once you hit your max passive, reload to trigger strengthened first shot, then you shoot, and then you empty the rest of your mag, and then you're done with the weapon. And that gives you your big scaling because there's a lot of really good scaling on the passive for this one. So what is the passive for the Executor? So the way this works is that you will have, when you max this weapon out, the hip fire accuracy and the aimed accuracy go to 0, so you don't have those anymore, the negatives. And this has a 5-stack buff that gets applied to you. Every time you shoot either a target that is currently electrocuted, has the debuff from electric damage, or you hit a target with all of your pellets that come out, which at base is 15. This is like the highest shell capacity in the game. It shoots 15 pellets per fire, which is wild. It will stack up a buff that gives you crit rate, increased accuracy, and when it's at full stacks, at 5 stacks, your next shot will have 30% firearm attack. This doesn't scale with the unique ability, so you don't have that there. And you'll also apply a special unique electrocution. I have tested this. This stacks with normal electrocution. It is a completely separate dot, so even if you have currently electrocution on there from a Descendant or from elemental damage, like electric damage, it will create a new instance of electrocution that is just this alone. This scales up to 4 seconds, which is 8 total ticks of damage, and each tick of damage is 100% of your firearm damage, which is massive. It is a huge, massive electrical dot. It does a bunch of damage. It's great against targets that are weak to electric. On top of that, it has a 3% defense down debuff. We've talked about this many times on this channel. The defense, all of the down debuffs right now don't scale super well, but having some defense down means it will be a small DPS increase when you have this electrocution on them, and you also get a little bit more fire firearm attack if you're shooting a target that is currently electrocuted. So what does this look like when you're actually testing it? So your main goal is to make sure all pellets land. And again, you will still get a stack if you hit a target and you miss some pellets and the target is currently electrocuted, but we are going to run with the electric enhancement on it so we can make sure that we trigger that on top of it as well. So when you shoot the target, you will have 15 pellets. When you hit all 15, you can see that I'm stacking up a buff next to my my head there. When this buff gets to 5 stacks, and every stack is adding crit chance, and it's giving you a little bit of scaling as well. When it gets to 5, your next shot will be amplified, and it will apply a big, fat, massive electrocution dot. And while that dot is ticking, they have defense down. So the only real way to run this weapon, because the normal scaling stats are so unbelievably terrible, is going to be scaling up this shot. However, after testing, I have confirmed a couple things. Firstly, strengthen first shot applies not only to all of the pellets that the shot fires, it applies to the 30% firearm attack scaling that the buff has on your next shot. It also applies to the electrocution dot, and also the bonus electric from the electric enhancement. So strengthen first shot gets a triple dip on this because it makes all of your passive effects better for that one shot. And that is why our main focus for this weapon is going to be hitting those 5 shots so we can stack up our passive. When we have our passive ready, we reload to trigger strengthen first shot, and then we empty. But that first shot after reloading, the dot, the defense down, the bonus firearm attack, the extra crit rate, all of that compounds together to make all of it stronger, and you actually get a large amount of elemental damage as a burst. Again, the major downside here is the burst damage is still not quite as impressive as Smithereens, and Smithereens doesn't also need to wait until this passive is stacked up to get the value. But again, this is off elemental damage alone practically. It's not really scaling too much off of its base damage. This is all the bonus elemental damage. So if this ends up having good base damage as well, I could see this DPS going up over 2 million just because the elemental component of it and the passive component of it is strong enough by itself already. So the final build for this, and I don't think there's any other builds for the Executor in the current moment just because the base stats are so terrible that you really are just going to be scaling the electric, and we are going to be running electric enhancement here instead of swapping out per element because we want to be able to trigger electrocution on the target to make things easier. We want to strengthen first shot, electric enhancement, rifling reinforcement, and action and reaction should come as no surprise to anybody. Shell up is a great choice here. It's a nice DPS throughput. You can see it's 22% on the module weighting over here on the left side. And I did run electric priority and electric gun barrel. The downside with electric gun barrel, even though it has more electric attack scaling on it, is that it lowers fire rate. And because we're so contingent on hitting 5 shots and then the 6th shot triggering our passive, fire rate slows down our ability to trigger our passive massively, and it ends up being too much of a DPS loss overall, not only for our normal DPS, but also getting to our passive and triggering it. So we'd rather run electric priority here, which is just going to be messing with your reload, which is a little bit more reasonable than electric gun barrel in that case. So electric priority does make the fit because we're almost entirely electric damage here. Fire rate up, weak point sight, and then you run double accuracy mods. Now, again, if you think you can land all pellets with only 1 accuracy mod, I actually think that just Hawkeye is probably enough for this weapon, though Shotgun does have a special Deadeye that has firearm attack on it, which is great, because not only does it affect your normal damage, it affects all your elemental damage as well. Firearm attack is still worthwhile, and it makes that accuracy there. However, if you can be accurate enough on the first few shots, it does have built-in accuracy, and this accuracy from the nuke ability does scale up, so this accuracy goes much higher, and you get accuracy per shot. The downside is that if you miss your first few shots, it gets harder to stack it up. So if you think you're skilled enough, like kind of as a skill element here, you can swap out Deadeye for something else for good damage, or you can swap out Hawkeye for even less accuracy, but you can get even more damage in there. Something like weak point sight would be a good, the blue weak point sight. They still, for whatever reason, I don't know why, they have a purple weak point sight that's only for shotguns, and it shares the exact same name as the blue weak point sight for all weapons. They have the exact same name. It has the icon of have aiming. It just does. I don't know why. It's the same thing. So I put it in parentheses shotgun so you know that that's where that comes from. Your weightings here for this build, strengthen first shot is still going to be your best. Even if you were to be perfect on hitting weak points with real life fighter, strengthen first shot is still going to be your best because it applies directly to your passive and for that single shot. And since a lot of our damage comes from that one moment, having 140% scaled up on the strengthen is better, but real life fighter is still an option. It also just has an accuracy down, which can make it harder to land all of your pellets. Electric priority is very high up on this. Action and reaction, elemental enhancement, rifling reinforcement, shell up, and you can run, like I said, unstoppable smasher or elemental conductor if you wanted to, and that's pretty much it. I wouldn't look at any other of the ultimate mods, the special mods. None of them really kind of make a big difference, and even with this, elemental conductor is not going to have perfect uprate unless you're playing an electric character that can actually apply electrocution on their own, because even with electric enhancement, you won't have perfect uptime of electrocution, so elemental conductor loses a little bit of value because of that. In the top right corner, you would have these stat weightings here. Firearm attack, shell capacity, and elemental damage from firearm attack are your highest weighted values. Then we do want fire rate, because fire rate is a global scalar. It applies full value to the weapon's DPS. It also allows us to stack the passive faster and get to that big burst shot on the 6th shot much easier. Electric attack percent makes the list because we're so focused on elemental damage here. By the way, I think this is cool. Like, most of the weapons end up being very similar in the first 4 or 5 mods that you pick, and the last 5 seem to matter not as much. And that's just the economy that we're in right now with how good some of the mods actually are and how the stat weightings are. So it is kind of cool that we actually have a weapon that scales with percent elemental damage. We don't get that very often in general, and you can see the weightings on the right side here for the reroll priority are very weird. We've never had this before in a weapon before. Bonus versus Colossi is going to be 46% weighting. Then flat electric attack, 27%, firearm 12, weak point 3, and because this weapon has a low maximum rounds in the magazine, it has a 1% crit chance and a 1.1 crit damage. Crit damage, crit chance, and rounds are effectively nothing. So unlike most weapons where you have a little bit of wiggle room on what you roll, I think you have to roll bonus versus Colossi, flat electric damage, firearm attack, and weak point on this weapon to get the most out of the rerolled stats. All of the other choices are pretty garbage just because it has no base scaling on anything else. So that's where the weapon is at right there. Again, good damage. 1.2, 1.3 is pretty good for a shotgun output. If this was like an impact round weapon or a special round weapon, I would say that this would be insanely good, especially if you have electric in your build already. But because it's a high power round that you're going to be a little bit more limited on, you might even want to swap out Deadeye or Hawkeye here for rounds conversion, like converting general rounds, special rounds, or impact rounds into high power rounds to have that there as an option. But those are going to be your stat weightings on the Executor. Super cool weapon. I think it looks great. It's very fancy. It's fun. And I think, again, if they end up changing any of the stats in this weapon, it could very easily become one of the best weapons in the game because it's carrying its weight on its passive alone, and there are no weapons in the game that can boast that. Every single weapon has a the best weapons in the game have a strong base and usually have a strong passive, unlike this weapon, which is pretty much almost entirely its passive. It's carrying its own weight through that alone. So if they make any changes, this thing is on the precipice. If you found value in today's video, leave a like down below, leave a comment for the algorithm to help this video get seen by more people, and don't forget to check out my other channels for other content and other stuff and other things.